Hello everybody and welcome to today's webcast in our SAP GRC series. Today's webcast, Kick Your Provisioning into Overdrive, Streamline User Provisioning with GRC 10 and Identity Management Integration. I'm joined today by Scott Osterman and Peter Hobson. I'll give an introduction to those shortly before we get into the details. I know many of you out there have joined these webcasts before, so I want to thank you for continuing to support us. And for anybody who's new to these webcasts, welcome. We do ask that if you have ideas of topics you want us to cover, please email us, contact us. Our details are provided at the end of this and are also in the materials. There are certain housekeeping items that I go through at the beginning of these webcasts, and I'm going to go through these now before I do the introductions and hand over. So the first thing is to go through a disclaimer. Certain matters reviewed today may represent services that PwC may be prohibited from providing to our audit clients. In those instances, the information is being provided to inform you of options that you may want to consider as you evaluate the solution described on today's webcast. Due to the complexity of independence rules, any potential services for our audit clients should be discussed in advance within the context of the independence rules. The information contained in this document is provided as is for general guidance on matters of interest only. PricewaterhouseCoopers is not herein engaged in rendering legal, accounting, tax, or other professional advice and services. Before making any decision or taking any action, you should consult a competent professional advisor. The next thing is to go through some of the administration. These are just general administration. For better viewing experience, close other applications. For better sound quality, use headphones. To enlarge the slides, click the bottom right corner in the slideshow window and drag the desired size, or click the green maximize button at the top of the right slide window. A question that we get asked all the time, are these materials available? Yes, they are. To download today's presentation, please click on the resources widget at the bottom of the screen and you should be able to download it from there. As we go through today's webcast, I really do want to encourage everybody out there to be as interactive as possible on a webcast. Please submit questions during the session. We will get to them either when we do the polling questions or at the end if we have time. Any questions that we don't answer during the webcast, we will follow up and provide you with the answers. And lastly, on this slide, if you experience any technical difficulties during the polling, and I'll cover the polling on the next slide, please reply to the question in the Q&A window, and I'll cover that when we get to each polling question. So for CPE credit, in order to receive the CPE credit, you must stay on for the entire 60 minutes. You have to respond to the polling questions. These polling questions will be, we have to do one in every 15-minute segment. The polling question will be on the screen for 1 minute at a time at a minimum. They're the requirements in order to get the CPE. At the end of the presentation, please click on the CPE widget and make sure that you follow the instructions, and then you'll be able to download your certificate. And lastly, for anybody who's listening to this on a replay, CPE credits can't be awarded for the replay. As I mentioned at the beginning, I'm being joined today by Scott Osterman and Peter Hobson. Scott, for any of those who followed this webcast series, Scott was on one previously, and I'm really excited to have Scott back. Scott leads our SAP security practice and really is a great source of knowledge in SAP security. He's connected to our global network and really has sort of built out our methodologies within SAP security, our GRC access controls, and then our integration to identity management. Scott's been involved with a number of GRC implementations and integration to IdM. Many of those are global implementations and have covered many countries and the complexities contained within. Peter Hobson. Peter's based out of New York. He has 9 years of experience doing SAP GRC and security. Peter also has a significant amount of experience in this space and has recently completed a project to implement GRC access controls and identity management solution for 15,000 users in 30 countries. So I'm very excited to have both of these presenting today's webcast, and I will hand over to Scott to go through the agenda.
Thanks, Jamie, and good morning, everybody, or good afternoon for those of you out east. as Jamie said, we're going to jump right into the presentation here. So really focusing on kicking your provisioning into overdrive with a focus on identity management and SAP GRC integration, access controls. From an agenda perspective, we're going to focus first a little bit of an introduction to the various products, both identity management, the concepts behind it, as well as SAP GRC access control and some of the functionality that's there that supports provisioning. As many of you know, and having participated on some of the previous conferences, Webcast, we've talked a lot about what access controls and those types of segregation of duties and emergency access type processes can do for you. This is a little bit different focus. This is going to be more about user provisioning and the automation of user provisioning. We're going to talk about why organizations integrate GRC and IdM, the benefits, the pros, cons, the reasons for one system over the other for various activities. The considerations that go with that, so a lot of decisions that need to be made, the type of implementation, the type of automation, and those types of activities. We're going to share some integration models, so specific models that have actually been implemented. You'll see that there are differences from organization to organization that we do come across, reasons for which we'll explain and get into some of the details for why a specific functionality is implemented one way over another, but really show some examples. Talk a little bit about a project and what's usually involved with the project, whether it's the activities and deliverables that you would typically expect, as well as a little bit of a high overview of a project plan and some examples of what that looks like. And ultimately conclude with some key takeaways and really the takeaways focusing on the benefits and the types of things that we've experienced. So throughout it, what you'll hear from both Pete and I is not only the detail on what's involved in integrating the two products and the benefits, but a lot of examples of how we've seen this happen in our clients in live environments. And Jamie was mentioning one that Pete was just finishing up. That's a global one that we've worked on together and a handful of others that we've both been involved on that are slightly different. And so we'll talk to what those differences are and just provide some real-life examples. With that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Pete here and let Pete get started with the next slide on introducing SAP GRC 10 access control.
Great. Thanks very much, Scott and Jamie, for the introduction. For everyone, I know Jamie mentioned this, but I'll reiterate it. For everyone that is listening in, please do try to make this as interactive as possible for a webcast forum. So do fire away with the questions and let us know what we can do to provide you more insights that may be an interest to you. What we're looking to do first is we're going to just baseline a little bit on some of the different technologies that we're talking here. This may be familiar to some of you, maybe a bit newer to some others, so we figured we'd just talk about it a little bit to get everybody on the same page. The first item, what is GRC 10? GRC is a pretty loose term standing for governance, risk, and compliance, but what we're really talking about here in this particular presentation is going to be about GRC 10 access control. The GRC access control suite, what that does is it's a suite of products that really allows you to monitor and measure and manage access risk within your application environment. The products are strongest in the SAP space, and they're very much tailored to monitor SAP access and provide insights to that. But they're also able to be extended out beyond that to other platforms such as Oracle, Hyperion, and any other legacy type systems. But really what you're looking to do, as you can see on the slide here, is that they help you in about 5 key areas: analyzing risk, managing access, maintaining roles, certifying authorizations, and monitoring privileges. So just diving a little bit further into it, so we have those 5 functionalities, but let's break it down how it actually covers and manages those items. So when you talk GRC access control, there's really 4 major modules that perform those 5 functionalities. One of them is the Access Risk Analysis Suite. I would look at that as your SOD reporting or Access Risk Analysis engine. That's the tool that has within the suite that allows you to view risk within your system from a user access perspective, provides insights on where it is, and allows you to monitor and mitigate that risk accordingly. You have the Access Request Management module. That's your automated provisioning and workflow engine. That's the tool that allows you to do end-user requesting of access. but it's also the workflow behind items like end-user access recertifications, and also helps you with the other suites as far as provisioning emergency access, mitigating risk that you identify with the access risk analysis tool, and also helps put a workflow around you building roles within the system. So when we're talking about this presentation, I'll note that access risk analysis and access request management are the two most prevalent within the discussion, though the other two, emergency access management and business role management, can also be used in some capacity within these integrated solutions. So to talk about what those are, emergency access management manages those situations where people may need additional privileges within in an emergency situation. So they're extended authorizations or entitlements that are temporary that need to be approved and monitored and from a compliance perspective. So that's what that tool does there. You might also be familiar with the term firefighter, which is that application as well. And then finally, you have business role management. That's a tool that helps you build your roles within the SAP system, and it also can tie some workflow around it, a 6-step process to make sure that you have the proper steps and detail taken care of before you put a role into production. So now that we've talked about GRC, let's talk quickly about IdM. So what is IdM? Similar to the automated provisioning model of GRC, IdM manages a user's entitlements and just basically their identity within a system. Different from GRC, identity management solutions really go at a broader and more holistic level. So you're talking about where you can actually create your entire digital identity through an identity management system. They're used for a variety of functions, some to just create actually someone's identity within an application landscape, and you can also go down to the entitlement level. Where we see these commonly, to give some insights, is when you're onboarding new users into your system, a lot of organizations work through IdM tools to be able to request the initial user within their landscape and get them their fundamental access such as email addresses, an ID in their Active Directory or other HR repository, and also getting them their VPN access if they need it. So that's where we see IdM. There's a lot of different products that we see in the market for IdM. You can see a few different ones here, such as CA Technologies. SAP has an IdM solution. IBM has its Tivoli software. Oracle has an identity management, and even Microsoft has its own product there. So there's a lot of different items that we talk about when we do get to an IdM perspective that will really be in scope when we're talking about integrating this with GRC access control.
And Pete, to add to that, some may also be familiar that Sun Microsystems also had a product as well as part of the Oracle acquisition. That product is Oracle WaveSet and is mostly being converted now over to Oracle Identity Manager as that product falls out of support. So one interesting fact is some of the more common integrations that we've seen have actually been with the old Sun product. And so what we've seen is taking of that and merging it to the new Oracle Identity Manager as examples. So you see the upgrading of it to the new technology. But certainly there's also homegrown systems. We have some instances where organizations have a homegrown request system, for example, through their help desk ticketing, and they're integrating that with GRC. So there's a number of different ways to do it. The beauty is that the technology that's provided by most of the identity and access management systems, as well as by GRC, provides web services on the technical side to allow you to integrate. So you could even, and we have some demos that we use that are actually Microsoft Access based, where you can build a form in Access and have that communicate with GRC and create requests. So the ability to integrate is really quite significant and taking advantage of it. However, for the most part, what we tend to see are these enterprise-wide identity management systems really leveraging the capabilities of GRC.
Hey, so we're going to move to our first poll question. As I said, I'll read the question and then you'll get a minute to answer the question. This first question, does your organization currently use a GRC access control and or an identity management tool? Option A, GRC access controls only. Option B, an IdM tool only. Option C, both. Option D, neither. And whilst I give you a few minutes to respond to that, we had a couple of questions come in The first question was around whether or not you've got access to the replay for previous webcasts. Yes, at the end of this, everybody who's on the webcast will receive a thank you letter for coming. It will give a link to the replay, and then you'll be able to look at other previous replays of events that we've had in the past, and that will cover all of the events that we've done in this GRC webcast series. I think what we'll do now is we'll have a quick look at the results for this. So the results that have come in, a lot of people out there don't have any GRC or identity management tool. I actually do find that a little bit surprising. I was expecting most people to have at least an access control tool in place and then less to be with the identity management tool. Scott, I don't know if you've got any comments on that, or Peter as well.
Yeah, from a standpoint of not having one at all, I think it gets to the discussion around how you might consider implementing this in the approach. I think there's a number of different approaches that can be taken from starting from scratch. A lot of times what we say is because there's a lot of compliance involved in this, I mean, the GRC product itself is really there to drive compliance, both from a segregation of duties perspective, managing, mitigating, and compensating controls, integrating into the control environment, that you sometimes need to look at how you start. And going straight to automated provisioning is not always the way in which you would want to start. You can make the argument that it just allows you to more efficiently and in a faster mechanism to creating more SODs. So the goal would really be to put in a process that would allow you to put in a product that looks at compliance. That might be GRC first. Based on that, you may need to make some adjustments to the underlying security model, underlying processes, and then look at automated provisioning through a GRC and IdM integrated product. Another approach may be that you have the integrated GRC deployed, and you start with just standalone GRC provisioning. So, as Peter was mentioning, you can do just provisioning automated through GRC all by itself, but we'll get into some of the reasons why organizations that do have enterprise-wide IdM, why they look to use that as the provisioning system. And that's a lot of common look and feel type of reasons and what users are used to, so avoiding change management concerns. But there's a lot of different ways you can go about it. So just, I guess that's my perspective on the couple options.
Great, thanks. And I think we're going back to Pete to continue.
Yeah, so we're going to, Scott, I'm going to continue on here with the next slide, really about kind of building on, I guess, that topic we were just talking about with the question, but why clients have integrated IdM. What have been the drivers? What you're going to see here is a little bit about both the concept of this SAP strategy and IdM strategy. A lot of our organizations have picked SAP, for example, as the product and the platform that they're going to use to run the business, whether it be financials, manufacturing, HR, et cetera, but standardizing on SAP and really asking the question for anything that they're trying to put in, why not SAP? So using that as a strategy, we'll look at GRC for how to support compliance within SAP. On the flip side with IdM, it's a lot about how are we getting to the users, what do we have today? So if we have IdM today, Oracle, Tivoli, Forefront Identity Manager, if we have that today, and that is the standard solution for the company for how access is requested, we don't want to veer off of that. The strategy is a common look and feel, a common system, a one-stop shop for getting user access, anywhere from SharePoint access to email accounts to, in this case, SAP access. So what our clients are saying is, you know what, we want to marry the best of both of those. We want to use IdM as the stop for a user for self-service to actually request access to the system. But we want to manage compliance through GRC and through SAP because that's embedded and connected directly to the SAP system, and the data can then feed to IdM. So bringing those two together allows them to address their end-user experience. For the most part, the majority of users we tend to see only operate in IdM. That's what they're used to. It's what they've been trained on, so there's no additional training. We see broader process automation, so that's both on empowering the business to make approvals and using all the automated workflows that come with an identity system as well as with GRC, so you use the best of both of those. And then compliance, segregation of duties information, that detail is provided to the compliance group typically through GRC. So that's where you would see really GRC taking a very active role in the forefront there with SOD. And overall increased metrics. So we can monitor end-to-end processes within IDM. We can monitor compliance within GRC. The reporting is there for both aspects within the respective tools, and it really ends up combining to a great integrated end-to-end system and has that impact for users where they're a lot more familiar with it. They can get the access faster and more accurately. So we see that generally it's been the leading practice. Now we have seen different ways in which that gets integrated and what happens in one application versus the other. So what do we do in IDM versus what do we do in GRC? We'll talk about some of that later in the webcast. As we look at some of the, with the next slide, continuing on with some of the benefits. Business-owned governance, that's a huge one. What I mean by that is rather than a request being placed into a help desk queue and then it's that process of, well, I'm waiting on my access with a lot of the users. I don't know where it stands. I'm just waiting. I've been waiting for a week. I've been waiting for 3 days. In this case, the users have the ability to do self-service, create the request themselves generally. The routing is all through the business. It generally will go to a direct supervisor. It'll go to a role owner. It'll go to compliance. But ultimately, it's very transparent who's the next approver. It's also very transparent that IT is really not involved for business requests unless there's an exception. So as quick as the individuals that need to do the approvals can go into the system, make the approvals, access can be assigned automatically. You could have a request turned around in a matter of minutes instead of a matter of hours, days, weeks in some cases. We've had some where SLAs are 21 days to turn around access requests. This changes that whole option. So that's a huge benefit to the business to be empowered to make those decisions. I won't hit on all these, but true identity management across the organization by consolidating and centralizing all of your access requests within IDM and then leveraging GRC for the SOD compliance, you have visibility within IDM to all of the entitlements that a user has within the organization. So be able to see that they have a network ID, that they have Outlook access or email access, that they have SharePoint, they have specific folders, they have a number of applications, they have SAP, they have SAP VW, et cetera. All of those things, you can see that within a centralized location, which is great. That also helps for user certifications down the road that tend to happen for SOX organizations that need to do that. And towards the bottom, you see that SOX access certifications. Ability to automate that. So you can leverage the technology to automate certification, which has been a big effort to do on a regular basis. So that's something else that we see it used for. From there, we're really going to shift into some key considerations that need to be thought through and evaluated as part of an integration. And Pete's going to take us through those key considerations.
Thank you very much, Scott. So we've talked a lot about the drivers for doing this, right? So what are the products? What are the reasons that organizations are undertaking this effort? Now we'll talk a little bit more about what you want to think about in order to get there. When you're talking about a solution that's touching potentially tens of thousands of users globally, the first thing that's going to jump to mind is everyone wants something different, right? So what you have to do is go through a pretty extensive exercise to collect those requirements and come up with what the solution is that you're going to put in place. What you also tend to find is that there's very differing requirements about what you want. Specifically, there's always a little bit of a different point of view between the business and compliance. Usually one with the business is pushing for efficiency, while compliance is looking for restriction and control. And so when you're designing one of these solutions, what you're really looking for is to strike that balance to say, all right, we're going to give this a boost to efficiency and make the business happy, but at the same time, we also need to put in these compliance checks to make sure we're covering off on those to keep the compliance guys happy. And then what really falls in the middle is you need to do that in a way that IT can design a solution and then step back from the process, right? So that's what you're really looking for in this, is to really merge those three different requirement types. It's by no means an easy task, but it's something that's very doable, and it's just something that you want to make sure that you're considering, everybody in the picture. And what we're going to dive into a bit over the next few slides is going to be, what are the things that you should be thinking about for each of these different stakeholders? So what does the business look for, the IT and compliance, to be able to really get you there to that solution. I'll also mention that as we're going through that, We're also going to be adding in a few different perspectives and some different stories of what people have dealt with to help give you some context about why those things are. That being said, before we jump into that section, I think we do need to come up and break for a CPE. So with that, I'm actually going to hand it over to Jamie Draper again. Jamie, if you want to take us through the next question.
Yeah, Pete, thanks for that. So the second CPE question, how would you describe your organization's SAP security role design? A, effective, B, sufficient but opportunities for improvement, C, insufficient, and D, other. Whilst I let people answer that, we've had some great questions coming in, and please do keep them coming. As I said, any of the questions that we don't get to on the webcast, we will answer after the webcast, so we'll get that back to you. There's some very specific questions coming into people's own specific situations, but one I think we can talk about a little bit specific and open up, and Pete, this is probably best for you. Do any of the elements of BRM need to be implemented for a GRC identity management solution to work, and what elements of HCM, human capital management, need to be present?
Sure, and that is a great question, Jamie. So what I'll answer, I'll start with the BRM question, then we can dive into HCM. For BRM, you don't need to have the module stood up. What you do leverage from BRM when you do these types of implementations is just leverage the role repository feature. So what you do need to set up in GRC is you're going to have your inventory of roles that will be hosted within the GRC system, and that technically falls between both automated provisioning and the BRM solution. So that's all you need to have from a BRM perspective. You don't need to use it to set up roles. You don't need to use the workflow components there. You just need to have that role master data available so that IDM can pull from it. For the second question related to HCM, and I'm assuming this is going to be linked to it being your master data repository because you need a source to gather all of your user information. You don't need to have SAP HCM in place. What you do need is to have a repository of all of your users. We've seen a lot of different items. SAP HCM is one, but not the only one. Another very popular one is Microsoft Active Directory. But what you just need to do is you have to have your inventory of users, and ideally what you have is you have all your key user information, username, email address, and also ideally manager information. If you have those three data points available in a single repository, that's what you need in order to be able to get going from that perspective.
Great.
And I think later on in the presentation, we'll cover a little bit of some examples of what happens when that source that you select isn't 100% accurate, and we'll talk through a little bit of the issues that come up from that perspective.
Thanks, Scott and Pete. Well, one thing just to clarify, and I probably should have done this at the beginning, BRM stands for Business Role Management, before I get a bunch of questions on that, which is how roles are managed within the SAP GRC solution. If we look at the response to this question, and one of the things I want to cover again, if you have problems responding to any of the questions on the poll questions, please just submit your answer through the Q&A. That way we can sort out the CPE credits later. Sometimes people do have technical difficulties submitting the questions, and you do need to answer all four of them in order to get the CPE credits. Very, very clearly, an outstanding winner in this poll question is that people believe that their role design is sufficient, but that there are opportunities for improvement. I think that's probably consistent with what I'm seeing, but Scott, if you want to add a few comments to that, that'd be great.
Yeah, I would say that's what I would expect. I think a lot of organizations have started out with a great role design, and it's a matter of how to maintain that over time. A lot of times when we see organizations that it's insufficient, it's more insufficient from the standpoint of being ready for automation. There's too many changes that need to happen on every request that comes in for access. They're almost building custom roles for each individual. That is not going to work really for an integration here, because you lose the benefits of that automation that I talked about in the business ownership when IT has to step in. What we'll generally see is somewhere between the need to make some modifications and clean up the design, bring some consistency to naming conventions if those weren't there, because that helps with the filtering, that would likely be put in place for how to drill down into the roles and essentially as you build a shopping cart of your access that you're building. So we'll see a lot of that from an opportunities for improvement perspective. I think generally there has to be some changes made a little bit to the design to really make the most of the automation.
Thanks, Scott. So I'll hand back to Pete to continue.
And thanks very much, Jamie and Scott. So what we're going to talk about now is start diving into the different considerations when you're talking to each stakeholder group, and we're going to start with the business. So the business is always a very interesting one that you have here, generally because their requirements are both very simple but very finicky at the same time. Okay, but when we're talking to the business, what they're typically driving for is simplicity and usability and efficiency. That's really their three drivers. And what's nice about IDM when it's integrated with GRC is it provides you a lot more ability and flexibility to be able to meet more of the varying needs. So one of the pain points that we'll get when we're doing a GRC access control implementation is that the forms and the end user interface are fairly static. Okay, so there's a couple things that you can modify, but for the most part they stay fairly consistent in how they look and how they feel. When we start shifting over to an IDM screen, what you're getting is two things. You're getting a lot more flexibility as far as how you can make the forms look, what type of information you present, and specifically additional information that people are looking for to help them make decisions. The other thing that you gain is familiarity. Right? The business is going to be getting a screen that they're used to interacting with already, rather than adding a change which says, all right, item number one is you request this access through application A and then SAP access through application B. But more so, what you're getting into is not only is it application B, but you have a different screen now that you need to interact. So there's more of a change in a learning curve. When you switch over towards this IDM form, there's less of a learning curve for the business. And because there's less learning curve and less change, they're generally much more responsive to the application. They adopt it much faster, and there's a much higher satisfaction rate when you actually go live with the application. And so when you're designing these types of things, that's what you're really looking for, because one of the key goals is to push this out to your business users and have them take ownership of it and own the provisioning process. The best way to do that is to adapt the application to look and feel and provide the information that they want in order to be able to do that. Some of the simple things like we talked about, what implications do they interact with, that speaks to the changes there. But I think really an important one that you want to look at is item number 3, which is what is my requester model? So when we're talking about that, what that really means is who is actually going to go into the tool and create the request for access? And why that's important is because there's really two ways to do it. You can go all the way to the end user and say each person is individually responsible and can start requesting their own access. But there's some organizations that like to go with a model where they do a key user or a help desk model, where end users, this change is transparent. They still make the request their own way, whether they call the help desk or email a key user, and then a person inputs it on their behalf. Both models really have their pros and cons, but it's definitely something to consider when you're deploying a tool of this nature, especially with the global reaches. We tend to see both. I think my clients have been more end user, where they push it all the way out to the end user, simply because you could look at it as almost the ideal model, because it really takes the burden and places it on the individual that needs the access. However, a lot of people like to have a key user one. Because of the change management that goes with it, you have to reach a lot less people, and then also the people that are picking it up tend to be much more familiar with the data that you're presenting when it comes to SAP roles and making requests, and therefore it's easier for them to adopt and adapt. So that's just some of the things that you want to think about when you're dealing with this from a business requirements perspective. Item number 5 is also something that I really like, what we really like about these integrated solutions. Again, getting to the static versus dynamic, what we've seen a lot of people do when they go towards IDM that they can't do in GRC is add certain custom functionalities that just make creating the request a little bit easier for your end users. Some of the common ones that we've seen is actually role recommendation type features, where it's almost an if-then logic that says if you request this role and you don't have that another role, then recommend that they add that to the request as well. And what those types of features do is it makes sure that the requester that may be a little bit less familiar has some additional insights to make sure that the requests are complete, and that when that finally gets approved, that their access works. We could certainly go into more examples, but that's really one of the key ones that we want to look at there. So that's a real big opportunity from a business perspective when you go IDM integration to be able to do that. The next one we'll take a look at is compliance. Realizing that can be sometimes an unpopular word when you're doing these things, they really are important to the success of these types of applications. What you can do, both with GRC and the integration, is be able to automate a lot of your compliance checks so that they're less impactful from an efficiency perspective and more complete so that they're more easily and more completely enforced. So what you're looking at here is a few different items. Ownership is big. When you go these models, you need to come up with your approver model and who's going to sign off on these items. And that's both from a roles perspective, an SOD perspective. There's a lot of different things that come into play there. The other thing that you need to consider is your SOD policy, and what are we going to do with SOD? Are we going to, if when it comes up, do we require people to fix it right then and there before we approve it? Or do we have a policy in place where it says, well, we can introduce this, but we need to fix it in 24 hours? What's important to you? I can tell you that most of our clients deal with the zero tolerance policy for SODs, in that they set up the tools to check for SOD automatically, and then if there's a conflict, they require that to be assigned, a mitigating control to be assigned, or the conflict to be resolved before they go ahead and allow the request into production. The final dimension is IT. And IT has a lot of skin in the game when it comes to one of these types of integrated solutions. One, they stand to gain a lot by removing themselves from the provisioning process. So that's a big win for IT organizations and a big reason why they like to go down this path. However, what you're looking at when you have this is that if you're going to step out of the provisioning process, there are new things that you're going to be picking up. So you're going to be swapping out certain activities for others, but ideally what you're getting is that the ones that you're going to be managing are less visible and less time intensive than the ones you had before. And really what those come up to is items like master data management. There's a lot of data that goes into this as far as keeping role owners up to date. If you have job mappings in the system, that needs to stay up to date, and just making sure you have that. Another item that really plays a big role, and this came up before, is about your HR master data source. A lot of these tools can only be as good as the HR data source that you have. So if you have a complete data source, you have a much more successful tool and application. If you don't, if you have a lot of gaps within there, it can lead to a lot of user frustration because people going to make requests may not be in there, and if they can't request, they can't get access, and it's a situation that nobody wants to be in. So certainly it's one of those things that you want to monitor and consider when you're doing these things, but sustaining the application becomes a big item for IT going forward. So you want to make sure that you consider what you need to maintain, how you're going to do it, and who's going to do it, and then find a way to structure the data within the system to minimize that impact as much as possible.
Pete, if I can add to that, a good example of some ones that we saw recently were the client was about to embark on a large-scale HCM update that was going to address a lot of the activities around the org structure and the assignments. And the challenge they had was that the integration of IDM with GRC was coming before that project had started. And so as we came across all the users in the various countries, what it was quickly determined was that a number of those users were not set up in the source system that was being used for the provisioning process. And so they had to make adjustments to get that data loaded, validate it, make sure the right managers were there, make sure the users were set up correctly and had the right types of IDs. Those were some activities that came on that brought some unexpected workload to the project because that data didn't exist. And eventually they'll shift to that new org structure and point everything there once it's implemented, but they needed an interim process. So you can't underestimate the data that's required to work through this and making sure that that's in place.
Thanks, Scott. So I think that's a good time to actually segue over to some of the common challenges that we see in these types of projects, because I think you brought up a great point there about, in that particular instance, the client set up their data in a way that was fairly labor-intensive and complicated to maintain, and I don't think that there was that expectation up front about just how much work that would be until they got one or two releases into the deployment plan. And so certainly that's something that, we want to address, and you want to make sure that you're considering when you're setting this up. Because one of the things that we found from that experience is that because they had data challenges, the user acceptance and the user satisfaction was lower than anticipated. And a lot of that was because when people were putting in requests, they were getting directed to the wrong person or potentially erroring out, which extended the time frame to get things done. And in that particular instance, there was a lot of scrutiny on turnaround time and making this more efficient. And so when you got some of those issues, when people were kind of in between on the application as a whole, it pushed them over the edge and made them a little bit more frustrated than they should have been with the application. So that's definitely something that you want to consider when you're going forward. Certainly, there's some other items there. As much as you can, you want to simplify things. Building on that point, it really is like you can do that from a lot of perspectives. It can be approvers. It can be, how we map the roles, how do we name the roles, things like that. There's a lot of different things that you might not have considered that used to be IT only that now become business visible. And so you have to consider what that looks like now. In the poll question, we talked a lot about role design, which sounds a bit outside of what you might deal with when you're talking IDM and GRC, because that's simply the pieces that you provision. But remember that now you're going to a spot where that used to be something that just your IT or security team handled. And so they looked at it, and as long as they knew what it meant, they were good. Now you're pushing that out to the business, and the business needs to take a look at that, look at the role, understand what it is to the point where they're able to request the right one. So that is something that, isn't, it's a consideration that you have when you do one of these things, and having a role design that may not be business transparent or understandable is something that actually is a big pain point for organizations, because once they go live, people look at the roles and the feedback is, well, I have no idea what to request. And so that's something that can be addressed by having a very nice business-friendly role structure in place to make sure that people know what to request.
And Pete, if we continue on to the next slide with success factors, and then we're going to jump into the third polling question. But some key success factors on a lot of these implementations. I'd say the first one is usability, involving the end users and the various people that will be involved from the get-go. What we've found before is that some of the screens are not intuitive, and because of that, that may drive where a particular activity occurs. Do we go to IDM because we can customize it a little bit more, or do we stick with the standard SAP screens on some of the GRCs? So I think that's one thing that we've seen. Important to involve them early and often. Don't wait until the end when it's user acceptance testing. Communications is important because you need to make sure everybody understands what's coming. The provisioning process is changing, what their roles are, who the approvers are, what they're going to do, where they're going to do it, and how they're going to do it. All very important to balance with communication and training that goes with it. I'd also say, I think the role structure, this gets to role design, and then the poll question again, that's important in terms of how that feeds the request process. Displaying a very technical SAP role name may be difficult for end users to do self-service, but if it said something like the journal entry processing or accounts receivable clearing, that may make more sense to an individual. That would be a reason to make sure that that's structured well so the data reads in business-friendly terms, and make sure you address the language requirements. There'll be instances where English is not enough. It's important to do that because the systems support it, and it does provide a much better user interface and user experience. The workflows are the other key. So making sure that the workflows are designed appropriately, the individuals that are going to receive approval requests understand what their role is. It makes it a lot more efficient and effective, and being able to maintain that approval workflow as managers and supervisors change jobs and role owners transfer, you need to be able to maintain that, otherwise that data becomes out of date, and then the approvers are not valid. So those are some very key indicators there. I think we're going to jump to a polling question now.
Yeah, I've jumped to the polling question just to try and keep us on track with timing for this. Is your organization planning an identity management, governance, risk compliance integration initiative? A, yes, late 2013 or early 2014. B, yes, late 2014 or beyond. C, evaluating one but no dates defined. And D, no, my organization is not planning an IDM GRC integration initiative. Again, whilst that's on for the minute, I'm just going to ask a fairly quick question. We had a question come in following the topic on business role management. When would BRM be used as opposed to the profile generator was the question that came up.
Sure, and so Scott, I'll take that one. Really, BRM is one of those items that you have the option to take over for profile generator. There's no defined rule about when it would take over and when it wouldn't. I think what it comes down to is whether that's something that meets your objectives. Business role management provides you a lot more information and structure about the way that you build your roles. So it's going to give you a defined process. I believe it's 6 steps, and that's customizable of the different checkpoints that you need in your workflow. It also provides you a lot more insights and documentation about the change history of your role. Okay? Our typical recommendation is that the tool is valuable and you can put it in place. When it has the most value is if you're undertaking an effort to redesign your roles. If you start with BRM at that point in time, then what you capture is the entire life of the role from the day it's built to the day it's retired all in that one spot. And so that's when we see the maximum value for BRM. But to wrap up the question, you can implement it at any time. It's just once you flip the switch, you want to go from using Profile Generator to BRM. You want to be using one, not the other.
Great, thanks. So just to quickly go through the results of this poll question, pretty much even to the decimal point between C and D. Basically, most folks out there are either evaluating but don't have anything on the near-term horizon, or they're not planning any IDM GRC integration. Scott, I don't know if you want to talk about that very briefly.
Very briefly, I would just say, this is something we see is advanced. So, like I was saying earlier, when you think about how to start putting this in, you've got to have a well-defined program for how you're going to attack this, and that's going to take, it's a roadmap that you need to think through and when the right timing is. Generally, we like to see the security environment nice and clean, SOD pretty much evaluated and an understanding what's there, then really move to automation. So I would say that it's good to have that structure, and we're starting to see a lot more of this than we have previously, but I expect that to continue to increase over the near future.
Thanks. Pete, if you want to take it back.
Absolutely. So what we'll talk about now is actually some examples of integrations that Scott and I have worked on to show you how different people have done this. So the first one we're going to show you is what we're going to call a full integration. This is one where they took an IDM application, which was Sun, and then took GRC Access Control 10.0 and merged the two functionalities together to administer their SAP Access. In this case, what you can see here is you actually have a mixed model for the applications that users interact with. The end users deal with Sun, the managers deal with Sun, but then the role improvers and the compliance groups are in GRC. So they did a split there. And a lot of the logic behind that was that the end users and the managers are less technical and also much more familiar with those IDM screens, whereas the controls group and the role owners were much more tech savvy, and therefore they felt that they would have much more success with the GRC screens, which offered a lot more information from a controls and SOD perspective than the IDM forms. And so that's the model that they went with there. Another key decision point in here is which one does the actual provisioning. As you'll see in this model, it's SAP GRC that's assigning out the roles. We'll show you later where they actually decided to do the role assignment via IDM. Another small item, but something to definitely think about. And then the last point is what you're getting here is that you'll see that they do all of their reporting or their heavy reporting through IDM. So they made it available so all the ticketing statistics, including the ticket status and whether it was in GRC, IdM, and the SOD components, were all reportable via IdM, but they could also leverage the audit logs and approval logs that you had in GRC to really give them a very complete picture from an IdM a compliance perspective. Moving along to this next slide here, I just want to talk a bit about the different items that you can do within these tools. So I know we've talked about new user provisioning and also modifying existing access. What this client did is it actually put 4 different types of requesting into IdM GRC, and that was both new and existing users. But they also used it for deep provisioning and terminations, and also for requesting emergency access or firefighter. And you'll see here, based on the tool, they actually had the approvals lined up differently. So you can see that all the end users, all the requests were through IdM, but then the approvals were in different spots. When you were requesting roles, you'd see those a lot in GRC when the approvals came to the role owners and to the controls group. But when you did firefighter or actual deprovisioning, that was all completely driven from an approval perspective in IdM. And that had a lot to do with who was approving and what they felt was necessary to be able to do that. So you see for deprovisioning and for firefighter, it's less approvals, mainly driven by the manager and all driven in IdM, because they felt that that was going to be the easiest adaptation for their users.
And Pete, I think as we move to the next slide now with another example, I think the biggest thing to understand there is there's no silver bullet answer, right? So you got to really evaluate what needs to occur over the course of the process, and then determine for the organization what makes the most sense for where that should happen, IdM versus GRC. So what you're going to see on this next example is really where there's a little bit of difference there, and the focus was on doing more in IdM and less in GRC. So this is a little bit different where provisioning happened directly from IdM instead of within GRC. GRC was really used for the SOD component. So manager role owner approvals would happen in IdM, maintain that all within one system, and allow the compliance activities to happen within GRC. GRC was still the source of the data that fed IdM. So a very similar integration, but yet where the users interacted with the systems were different from the first example of what that client was. And you see that as you go to that next slide, which shows across the different access types of requests, same thing, right? So you see things around new access and modify, as well as deprovisioning and revoking and firefighter. So just a little bit of difference. We see a lot of different approaches to it. I have some that have done a partially automated, where they have a feed from GRC into IdM, but they don't automate the request going through GRC. It's a little bit different type of implementation. It has to do with some of the versioning and situations that they had ongoing. But each one can be unique, and that's the beauty of the flexibility that the web services provide from the products to allow you to customize that interface and how you want to use it. I think we're going to shift now to a little bit about a project, what's involved, and what to expect here as we start to wrap things up with this the project information and some key takeaways, and we'll certainly wrap with our final any Q&A as well as the polling questions. So Pete, you want to take this next section?
Yeah, absolutely, Scott. Thank you. And so what we're laying out here is just a high-level timeline of a typical IdM GRC project. The first thing that you'll note, it's anywhere between 4 to 8 months to get all this done when you're considering go-lives and hypercares. And there's really a few key buckets that you want to deal with. You're looking at going through a life cycle where you do your design work and defining your master data strategy. Those are the 2 key upfront activities. You can configure your workflows. Then you have a pretty extensive training and testing phase, followed by KT, and finally hypercare. So the big success factors here is if we're looking through the different phases. From a design, it's all about the simplicity of the design, right? You're coming up with the right features to meet your requirements, but that are also hitting key compliance checkpoints and also being able to be sustained over the long term. After you get this live, you want to make sure that it remains a viable and relevant solution. The other key item is the training and the knowledge transfer. What we've really seen as a success factor, and Scott alluded to it earlier, it's how well people accept the tool. And the way to get people to accept the tool is to do training. And so what you'll see here is you notice that the KT starts happening much before the go-live, then you extend it well beyond. And if you do those types of things, what you're able to do is make sure you reach the users before the change comes, when the change happens, and after it's occurred. And what we found is that really helps with the responsiveness to get people to accept the tool and use it and making it part of their everyday processes. So I think with that, Jamie, did we want to go over to the last CPE question, and then we'll move over to takeaways?
Yeah, absolutely. So the fourth CPE question, how does your organization currently provision access to SAP users? A, SAP GRC access controls. B, identity management tools such as SAP IdM or Computer Associates IAM or Tivoli. C, ticketing systems such as Service Desk or Remedy, or D, other. And we'll give you a minute or two to answer that.
And Jamie, based on one of the answers to the earlier question, I would guess that we'll probably see more of C would be my guess. So it'll be interesting to see the results.
Yeah. So I've had a number of questions, and I'll read this one out, and it's sort of a clarification question, but there's been a couple around this and the interaction of GRC and IdM. The question is it possible to just kick out of GRC to IdM for the manager approval? The company in question is trying to avoid creating thousands of local accounts for supervisors directly in the GRC system.
So I would say the answer is yes, but it's not really a kick out of GRC. I think if you initiate your request through the identity system, generally we would see it go to the supervisor directly before it goes to GRC. What that allows you to do is say, the direct report, yes, this person needs this access. They either approve it or decline it, all or nothing. If they approve it, it then creates the request in GRC. We don't usually see it go the reverse, where a user creates it, it goes to GRC before a manager approval. Because if it needs to end at the manager level, there's no sense in going through SOD checking and secondary role owners if the manager themselves is not going to approve it. So we do usually see that outside of IdM. In fact, almost every integration I've done, the managers have not been logging into GRC for exactly the reasons that were outlined there about creating all the accounts.
Great, thanks. Results. Okay, for some reason a little technical difficulty. Hopefully everybody can see the results that are going to screen. Scott, as you predicted, C, the ticketing system is actually the most popular answer, and I think that was pretty much what we expected based on the responses we'd had so far. I don't know if you wanted to add a little bit more to that, or whether we should just move on.
No, I think we can move on. I think that's what we expected based on the earlier response.
Great.
I think at this point we really have put up some of the key takeaways, and we can highlight some of those. I also see that there are a number of questions that are coming in that are some really good questions, and like Jamie said, we will follow up on some of those. Anywhere from questions about how to deal with language translations and what that takes, to types of SODs and the way to run SOD. A lot of those types of things we will definitely respond back on from that perspective as it gets into some of the detail. To wrap it up, Pete, you want to just quickly hit on some of the key takeaways that are there? And
yep, absolutely, Scott. So I'll take everyone through that. So when we're just rehashing what we talked about today, a few of the key items as we go through them, and we gave you 5. These solutions are all about gaining alignment between your different stakeholders, right? All have their requirements, all have goals and objectives for doing this, and it's about collecting those, merging them, and bringing them together in a way that meets everyone's requirements and keeps everybody satisfied. You're able to do that, you end up with a very good solution. The consistency of the user experience is one of the big drivers why people do this. When you're doing these things, always think about what can we do to make the user experience easier? Because at the end of the day, keep the users happy, you get the tool acceptance, you keep using it, you get better use out of the tool and the work. process design and role design and other master data have impacts on this. So it's really, once you get outside the requirements gathering, data plays a big part. So make sure that when you're considering the solution, you're considering the inputs in addition to the overall design. So you design your solution, you have all the requirements, and make sure that your data that you're presenting and sharing with the users that they ultimately have to request meets the requirements, is in a format that they can use it. IDM provides a lot of opportunities to customize beyond standard functionality in GRC. So when you're looking at this, a way to simplify that user experience and to simplify some administration activities, it's customization. So you can change those forms and align them to what people expect, and also build in those functionalities like that role recommendation that I was talking about before, to be able to simplify the experience for all the different stakeholders and all the different consumers of the tool. And finally, we touched on this in the project plan slide, effective knowledge transfer. The more you can do around this, the more that you can notify, communicate, and train around the change, the better the results will be from the project long term, because you're going to see higher acceptance and higher satisfaction from the tool, the better that people know it's coming, prepare for it, understand it, and use it. So with that, Jamie, I'm actually going to turn it back to you to close things up.
Yeah, thanks, Pete. So, as I said, thank you very much, everybody, for submitting questions through the Q&A. We will respond to them afterwards. I think people are starting to drop, so we'll wrap up. The one thing I just wanted to remind everybody, the next webcast that we've got coming up is the daunting task of journal entries, tips and tricks for identifying and controlling manual journal entries in SAP. That will be on November the 5th. This is a hot topic, I think, as most people out there, if they're in the compliance realm, are feeling the pressure from the external auditor, as the PCAOB is asking the auditors to focus more on review controls, journal entries, and segregation of duties. So we want to get that topic out to everybody. So thank you very much, everybody, for attending, and I'll hand it over to the moderator to put up the last slide and close up.